So this is John Beswick from Wellington, who worked in Wellington Hospital. In what capacity was it, Don?
Medical electronics,
Yeah.
part of the biomedical engineering department.
And so you had an experience that made you aware of certain things that are happening in New Zealand in terms of biochemicals?
Oh yes, yes. Back in 1987 and 88 there were 5 of us at Wellington Hospital who were struck down with this mystery illness which was later identified as ME, or myalgic encephalomyelitis. And there's one chapter on the 3 mystery deaths in Dunedin in August 2003, and I referred to the news item on TV1 where they interviewed a local doctor and who was aware that the anticoagulant effect and the hemolytic effect, the causing bleeding in the patient's lungs, was as though the patients had been infected with snake venom. And this should have rung alarm bells in the medical fraternity, but it didn't. There was not a word about it, apart from this doctor's comment on TV. Now, there are 2 sorts of snake venom. There's the neurotoxic snake venom, as from the cobras, and there's the hemolytic venom, as from the rattlesnake family. Both are lethal, of course. And what's interesting is that the hemolytic venom is the one that dissolves tissues and causes internal bleeding, and it also has an anticoagulant effect in the blood. Now, we know there's documentation showing that in countries, not only in Russia but in the United States, snake venoms have been examined in great detail, the genetic structure, and they've been grown in various viruses so that the virus can infect a host cell, and the host cell then can make snake venom. Now, if you're infected with a virus of this sort, then in other words, a virus with a foreign gene, then the body produces more virus particles, and at the same time the body's biochemistry, which is hijacked by the virus of course, produces snake venom. So in that sense it's the victim that causes his own destruction.
So the secondary effect is to the body produces its own snake venom which kills you?
That's right, yes.
So that's the ME, is it?
Well, something like, this is actually a slightly different topic. I don't relate that to ME because the snake venom thing is a lethal thing. So there were 3 deaths, and I'm personally convinced that they would have to be authorised, and they would have to be authorised by the Minister of Security Intelligence, which at that time, of course, was Helen Clark. And there's a pretty damaging sort of accusation.
So just tell me how you think this worked. Do you think that she gave an overseas organisation permission to come in and to use genetic warfare, something like from America or that sort of thing, CIA?
Oh, it would have come from there through the SIS, would have to.
Yeah, into the CIA, from the CIA to the SIS.
Yes, yeah, and from the laboratories that are working for the CIA, yes, yes.
And so then he isolated pockets elsewhere in the world, aside from Dunedin, Tapanui, and...
Oh yes, yes, there's a list. In my book there's a list. There's a book called The Clinical and Scientific Basis of Myalgic Encephalomyelitis and Chronic Fatigue Syndrome. It's about, it was 800 pages, something like that, quite a big thick book. And at any rate, which comes from the Nightingale Research Institute in Canada, and various chapters are written by various people. And Dr. Peter Snow of Tapanui wrote one chapter on the New Zealand situation. What was interesting also about the Tapanui flu is that at the time when the people around that district were getting sick, the sheep were also having abortions, aborting their lambs, and the medical fraternity apparently didn't connect up these 2 things. They thought they were 2 entirely separate, sort of coincidental things. But if we go back into this VEE thing, this VEE illness, Venezuelan equine encephalomyelitis, then VEE causes the sort of symptoms that you see with the ME as earlier described, and it also causes abortions in animals such as sheep. Sheep can be affected. Now, it's a pity that the brains of the dead lambs weren't examined for VEE, but I mean, nobody in the medical establishment here was nowhere near it.
Yeah.
So the evidence is long gone, of course.
Right.
But it was first discovered in, or first observed, shall I say, in the Royal Free Hospital in London, and that was 1955, where 292 staff members were struck down with this mystery illness. It's not a contagious illness, so it hasn't been brought in from overseas by a carrier.
So how did it get here, do you think?
Well, if you go through my book, the conclusion that I have come to after much digging around is that it is deliberate and that it was aerosol dissemination.
How? In Wellington Hospital?
Oh no, not in the not at the hospital, but in it could be a person's home, it could be in a public place, it could be any other place.
So there were 4 people in Wellington that were struck down?
5 of us.
5?
Not all exactly at the same time.
And did you all work in the same place, for example?
No, there were 2 of us in the biomedical engineering department. There was a nurse manager, there was a medical librarian and a charge orderly.
All within the Wellington Hospital?
Yes.
And
so there's no pattern of common usage of the facilities or anything like that.
So tell me the story of what happened next, once you got struck down.
Oh, 6 months of intense pain, 6 months of sheer hell, torture. The only visible manifestation 6 months later was that my hair had turned from blonde to white, which was
And so were you bedridden in that time, were you?
Not quite, but I was certainly off work. 2 of the other staff members, the other chap in biomedical engineering and the charge orderly, were hospitalised for I think it was a couple of weeks in their worst periods.
Right. And
the other chap from biomedical engineering, Chris, I used to see him at 4:30 each day after work. I'd go up to the ward.
So tell me about the symptoms and what do you think this disease is?
It was an incapacitating illness with pain, which was rather like having knife blades or razor blades embedded in the flesh of your legs, and every time you tried to move that the razor blades would be slicing into each other, and a very, very painful sort of thing. All you wanted to do was lie flat on your back in bed. Anything else was very, very difficult. And there's also pains in shoulders and neck and things like that as well.
And so have you been able to link what this illness might be?
Oh, it was subsequently one of the women, the medical librarian, was diagnosed outside the hospital as having contracted ME. All they knew at Wellington Hospital when we were diagnosed was that it was something involving the nervous system, which of course is what ME is regarded as. Although of course the psychiatrists say it's just a psychiatric illness, but that's I'd see as being a cover-up. The psychiatric profession regards ME as being a psychiatric illness, and that these people are just imagining it, and it's just due to stress and things like that. But oh no, this muscle pain situation, it's not a psychiatric thing. That was definite. I found that you could get only about 3 hours sleep a night, because that was about as long as I was able to lie in one position in bed without turning. But the moment you turned, and then the pain in your back and so forth, the spine and the legs and everything, then you'd be awake, and that would be the end of it. So I existed for literally months on 3 hours sleep a night.
How many months?
Oh, 6. Yeah. 6 months was the usual time at that time in New Zealand.
Same with Tapanui, same with what you had.
Yes.
And
yes.
Same with in London.
Yes, that's right. Yes.
Yeah.
Oh, there were a few isolated cases a bit sooner and a little bit later. But,
have there been any cases in Canada or America?
Oh yes, most certainly. Oh yes, yes. There's been about 50 or 60 outbreaks in the Western world. Well, not so much around the world, but in the Western countries, in particular, the United States, Canada, Great Britain, Australia, and New Zealand, in particular.
And so, do you think we've been guinea pigs to some
yes,
sort of experimentation?
Yes, because there is an agreement for the testing and research and development of biological weapons, and the 5 parties in the agreement are the United States, Canada, Britain, Australia and New Zealand.
So somebody walking up a corridor could puff a whole lot of these particles out in the atmosphere if you're the next person walking by, you could contract this disease. Is that how it works?
No, it's not usually. It has to be done by some form of dissemination from a little canister rather than from another person's breath, because the particles, once they get into the patient's lungs, they will get into the bloodstream rather than get breathed out.
A canister puff rather than by somebody breathing out.
Yes, because that would make it contagious, you see, if that was it. And it's not a contagious illness.
Right.
So we know that, therefore, it hasn't been brought in from overseas by a carrier.
Or by another human being.
Yeah, exactly. You're starting to get to this picture. Should I just mention World War II very, very briefly?
Yes.
The governmental position on nuclear weapons is pretty well understood, and I think Helen Clark made that quite clear when she was Prime Minister, in that New Zealand is totally opposed to the use of nuclear weapons, and of course so are doctors, and I think just about everybody else. As far as biological weapons, an entirely different situation existed. New Zealand signed the Geneva Protocol in 1930, and the Geneva Protocol was for the prohibition and war of asphyxiating and other gases, and of course it developed, or the concept developed from the injuries that people had and deaths from the battlefields of World War I, of course, which was all chemical weapons at that stage. So New Zealand signed the Geneva Protocol, but held 3 reservations, and the 3 reservations were that the New Zealand government reserves the right to use chemical and biological weapons against non-parties, that is, non-parties of the Geneva Protocol. The New Zealand government reserves the right to use chemical and biological weapons against violators of the protocol, and the New Zealand government reserves the right to use chemical and biological weapons against allies of violators of the protocol. Now, that sort of information, of course, is national security type information, and you won't find that very, very easily. The place where you normally would find this information, and where I found it, is in publications from SIPRI, S-I-P-R-I. Now, SIPRI is the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute. They are not a protest organisation like Greenpeace. SIPRI is a government-funded organisation. It is funded by the Swedish government. It was set up in 1966 to monitor chemical and biological warfare developments in every country in the world, and there are experts from many countries, east and west, which contribute to SIPRI. And the New Zealand government at various times has given information to SIPRI through the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade, and established that privately. Now, the 3 reservations were part of government policy behind the scenes until 1988. In other words, from 1930 to 1988, that was the official government policy, the Cold War policy, of course. And in 1988, which incidentally was after those of us at Wellington Hospital had been infected, and after the Tapanui flu outbreak, and of course Tapanui flu was the first recorded outbreak of ME in New Zealand, and it's not flu, of course. So at any rate, the Tapanui flu occurred in around 1984, and those of us at Wellington Hospital, we were 1987-88. At the end of 1988, David Longy decided that these reservations should be withdrawn, but it was done after the parliamentary sessions had finished for the year, and therefore it does not appear in Hansard, and the only way I was able to find out was to make a specific inquiry through the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade. So again, you see, it's all done behind the scenes. We've got to keep these sort of things away from the general public of New Zealand, otherwise they'd start asking awkward questions. Right. Now, as far as the countries in this agreement that I mentioned, being the United States, Canada, Great Britain, Australia and New Zealand, during World War, it goes back to World War II basically, the 3 countries involved during World War II were the United States, Great Britain and Canada. And in the United States, which where I think was driven from, the Germ warfare project at Fort Detrick was basically second only to the Manhattan project of the atomic bomb. quite a lot of information is known now about the Manhattan Project, but the germ warfare project at Fort Detrick, that's quite another story, because this is an ongoing thing, of course. At any rate, Australia joined that agreement in 1965, and sometime between 1965 and 1981, New Zealand joined in as a fifth party to this agreement. And it was confirmed by Dr. Rex Watson, who was a former director of Portendown, and Portendown is the British chemical warfare establishment, which has a biological warfare development section in it. And Dr. Rex Watson was interviewed by Harrison Paxman for their book, A Higher Form of Killing. And he was interviewed in November 1981, and he said that the main contribution of Australia and New Zealand to the agreement was for the testing of equipment developed in Great Britain and the United States. Now, he didn't say what that equipment was. It could be anything from jungle sun hats to aerosol spray devices. It's unlikely to be jungle sun hats, but aerosol spray devices would certainly fit the bill. This is an intelligence service issue, because we're dealing with matters of national security. Now, another example of this five-party agreement, of course, is the Echelon project, which is this snooping on the satellites and emails and all this sort of stuff, and the Waihopai station and so forth, and down near Blenheim. So again, that is another example of the five-power cooperation: Australia, New Zealand, Great Britain, Canada, United States. So they're all in the same sort of thing. And as far as intelligence matters are concerned, New Zealand is and has long been known as a member of the so-called Inner Club. So, well, where do we come to? We come to 1988. Well, that's okay. The Geneva Protocol reservations have been lifted, behind our backs, of course, but germ warfare experimentation is still legal in New Zealand. It had to be legalised, of course, under this Geneva Protocol set of reservations, because if you're going to use people as human guinea pigs, then you've got to be able to legalise it, all right? So what do we have? We know that there's the SIS has the authorisation to collect intelligence relating to matters of national security. The effects of germ warfare agents is certainly a matter of national security. That is why the CIA had various germ warfare projects, such as MK Ultra, which ran for 10 years, and that was a mind control and germ warfare project with 149 sub-projects in it, and that is an illustration that it's a security intelligence sort of thing. And we know in the Russian situation, it's the intelligence agencies that are involved in all this sort of thing. Yes, if we look at the legal situation, I think I'd have to just check now on my notes, but I think it was in the Bill of Rights Act where it says that nobody should be subject to biological experimentation without their consent. But there's an earlier clause that says that these provisions can be overridden by other provisions from other acts. And of course the Security Intelligence Service Act to gather information is one such act that overrides it. So you don't really have any protection under the law against being used as a human guinea pig. And I did actually submit, or at least I submitted a question to the Human Rights organisation before I got my book published or printed, and the question I asked was whether being used as a human guinea pig was contravening any part of the Human Rights Act. And it's not part of the Human Rights Act, because the Human Rights Act doesn't cover things like security intelligence, and it does cover all sorts of discrimination in other contexts, but it doesn't cover things like racial and religious discrimination in the selection of employees for security intelligence, for instance. So if you're the right church and the right colour or whatever, then you can get into the SIS. And of course some of us may know that one of the prime movers in setting up the SIS initially was Foss Shanahan, devout, or some might say fanatical Catholic, who was quite in an instrumental position in World War II as the Organisation for National Security Secretary.